whenever this comes up is that everyone has to then feel like they have to say, just because something is anti-Semitic, they then have to say also, well, there is a lot of anti-Muslim hatred that's happening at the same time. And I think that is unhelpful, because what we're seeing, I think, is a rise of real anger, real frustration on perhaps on both sides, but there is only one group who are really out on the streets causing a great deal of commotion and hurt. And they're the ones that I think government need to tackle.
Why do you think we're seeing, and some people feel it's come on very suddenly, but perhaps it hasn't, a lot more talk of late about Islamism, anti-Semitism, religious hatred, Islamophobia? What's going on?
Well, I think those issues have always been there. And I think we've had it for a very long time. It's become very obvious now, particularly since October the 7th, where you've seen, so many people come out onto the streets, so many people supporting the pro-Palestinian marches, and there being this understanding, I think, that a lot of it is very anti-Semitic, a lot of Jewish people feeling very under threat. That has raised its ugly head. And I think
it's not just threat, though, is it? It's incidents as well.
Of course. I mean, and there is a false equivalence, I think, whenever this comes up, is that everyone has to then feel like they have to say, just because something is anti-Semitic, they then have to say also, well, there is a lot of anti-Muslim hatred that's happening at the same time. And I think that is unhelpful, because what we're seeing, I think, is a rise of real anger, real frustration on perhaps on both sides, but there is only one group who are really out on the streets causing a great deal of commotion and hurt. And they're the ones that I think government need to tackle. And I really want government and our big institutions, whether that's the police or broadcast or print media as well, to actually speak plainly and boldly to call out some of these problems that we've got.
Well, let's do that by explaining why there has been a row about the use of the phrase Islamophobia, because some people don't understand why that is problematic. Or is it problematic in your view?
No, I think it's shorthand. I understand. Look, we all know what it means. I do think we've ended up getting fixated about the actual use of the term. I personally don't use it. I don't think it's a particularly helpful
Why
term.
don't you use it?
Well, because I think it's a psychiatric term. I mean, to be phobic, to have a rational hatred or fear of somebody, I don't think that necessarily helps explain somebody who might have very rational fears about Islamists and Islamism. There needs to be a distinction between what is Islamic, what is Muslim, and what is Islamism, and what is Islam. And I think a lot of good work has been done in recent years to make that distinction. I think some of that has been undone in recent weeks. I was very pleased to see the Prime Minister, I think, make his speech on Friday night where he made that distinction again. But nevertheless, I do think we've got to get our language right on it. I don't like the term because I think it doesn't.
Yeah.
I don't think it's very helpful.
And when you say it's been undone in recent weeks, what are you referring to specifically?
Well, I think where you've certainly seen the comments from Lee Anderson and perhaps from Suella Braverman as well, where I think they, for political purposes, not necessarily for the greater good, I think for their own personal political purposes, I think they've weaponized faith, they've weaponized the language around it, and I think that's been unhelpful. But also, both the PM's response and the Leader of the Opposition and the Speaker of the House of Commons, their collective responses, I think, have not necessarily been as brave as they could have been.
Do you think one of the problems is that at an establishment level, perhaps in this country, we pay too much respect to religion? I mean, we've got a head of state who's head of the church. We've got bishops in the House of Lords. We've got an established church. And, Rishi Sunak goes out there and immediately he talks about his faith as a Hindu, Muslims. I mean, a lot of people in this country are now secular.
Yeah, there are a lot are, but the vast majority of the population have a faith. More people have a faith than not. More people have a faith than have a disability, more people have a faith than have, meet any other single protected characteristic. And in fact, as my report goes into some detail to explain, just because faith is more diverse than it's ever been, but there is still more faith,
But one way could be,
and it's growing.
One way could be to go the French way and say we're going to have a lay state. We're not going to have state-funded religious schools and things.
No,
like that.
I mean, look, I mean, that would be I think we could decide to go down that route. The point is that we do have people. The British population is made up of all kinds of different people with lots of different faiths. The reality is, though, government for the most part is faith illiterate, and we need to improve faith literacy. We need to improve faith literacy with the police. We've seen people get arrested for, preaching outside Uxbridge train station and other places like this. Really, I think unnecessarily, because there is a lack of faith literacy everywhere. So we need to improve faith literacy. Broadcasters need to be more faith literate, as does politicians. I think we all do need to improve our faith literacy. The vast majority of people of faith, the vast majority of all people are very peaceful, very kind, very generous. What we've allowed, because of our lack of faith literacy, we've allowed the extremes of faith, particularly with Islamists and those people with, Islamist extremists. We've become very scared of it because we've not understood it, and we've allowed those people to then, really, I think, dominate the narrative in a way that I think we've got to tackle, and we've got to do it bravely.
Yeah, and I want to take you back to something you just said about politicians weaponizing this. I mean, what's the result of that? Why do you think they do it, and what is the result of them choosing to do that?
Well, if you take Lee Anderson for example, I like Lee personally, and I think I don't think he's clumsy as he said he is, and I don't think he's stupid.
You think it was deliberate?
Absolutely deliberate. He wants to remain an MP. He wants to keep his seat. There's no chance he's going to keep his seat as a Conservative MP. He's basically playing to a particular narrative, and he will probably end up being either an independent candidate or a Reform candidate in his seat, and he'll probably win it. So for me, that's just clear politics, and I'm surprised that he's been allowed to sort of run away with it in the way that he did. And similarly with Suella, it's very clear that Suella Braverman wants to be the leader of the Conservative Party after the next election, and she is appealing to a base within the Conservative selectorate, Conservative members, who think that the language that she takes will be very popular. I don't think that's necessarily the best language for governing.
And does it increase the risk of reprisals, of terror attacks, of groups kind of going into themselves? Because I think what we've seen with the election of George Galloway is a very firm and instant rejection of those people who have chosen to vote for him. Now, some people say that that's because he's got very strong views and we should call those out. But others say there is a risk that you then turn people away in on themselves. And actually that could have a very dangerous impact.
Well, I think what we'll see is that, every time somebody like George Galloway sort of comes on the radio, comes to the fore, and people don't talk plainly about it, then those on the other side, what people in the media are calling the far right, I choose to say, let's call them, neo-Nazis or white supremacists. They feel emboldened, and actually, one is it's the creation. It's this Frankenstein monster that is sort of coming up because people like Galloway and others are saying what they're saying. And I'm sorry to say that I think the more we see these pro-Palestinian marches throughout major capitals, the more we see projections of hatred put onto the side of buildings, and the less we see police take firm action. You're going to see more people on the other side feel that they are a majority, I think, but feel that they have no voice and that they will want to do something about it. And I am worried, Kate, that we are going to see more civil disobedience and more disruption because we are not tackling the elephant that's in the room.
I want to move on to talk about something slightly different. But before I do, we've had a text from someone who says they're quoting you saying, we all know what Islamophobia is. And they're saying, I'm actually pretty confused by that definition and the interpretation. But like so many, I'm too uncomfortable to ask. Please, could you address this?
So, look, all prejudice is wrong. We need to be very clear that if somebody is demonstrating prejudicial behaviors or language against anyone because of their faith or because of their sexuality or their gender or whatever it might be, that is wrong. But I think to say something is phobic that is a psychiatric term. That's why I personally don't like it, because I think there are sometimes very rational reasons why somebody might feel a bit concerned or a bit tense around some of the behaviors of Islamists and Islamism. That's not to be confused with Islam and Muslims. And I think we need to make a better case to say that the vast majority of British Muslims are peaceful, kind, and generous people. And they are also the biggest victims of Islamist extremism. And they rely on government and they rely on the police to protect them from that minority that exists within a minority. And the more we get kind of captured by or the less brave we are, the less capable we will be of protecting those people who we need to look after, and they rely on us to do it.
I want to just talk about extremism in politics, but also about radicalization. There's a really interesting interview with Andrew Bridgen's wife, and Andrew Bridgen, has been accused of being radicalized essentially by the anti-vaccine movement. His wife says that the Conservative Party didn't pick up the early signs of indoctrination and radicalisation. They dealt with him by cancelling him. And that was the moment that it opened up the doors for all these people to come in and radicalise him further. What do you make of that?
I think Andrew's a very troubled person. And I think if you look at the last few years, he's had lots of court cases and, issues with his family's business, and I think issues with his own family. And then, the little that I've had to do with him, I've always thought he's actually quite a lost and troubled individual.
But do you think parties need to get better at recognising this radicalisation question? Whether or not it's about Andrew Bridgen, he's one example, but there could be the potential there for MPs to end up in a place where they don't want to be.
The job of the whips is both to get government business done, but also to have a pastoral mindset and care for their members of parliament or for their parliamentarians. And I think this may be a case where the whips might want to have a look at themselves and say, did we do enough to look after somebody who I think is very troubled? Certainly some of the stuff that he says, I think, is bonkers, I think is probably the polite way of putting it. And he's a bit of a distraction for other things that has been going on with him. Look, he's lost the whip, so he's no longer part of the Conservative Party. I hope whatever demons he's struggling with, his better angels shout them down. But no, I think this is a bigger issue, actually, Kate, around the pastoral role that whips have, both on all political parties. I think they could do a better job, and certainly with the story that was in today's Times on him and his ex-wife. I mean, it's just a horrible story to read. Very sad.
Just finally, you have written this report. It is very long. It's very detailed. It has lots of recommendations for the government, and yet they haven't responded yet. I mean, are you disappointed about that? What would you most like them to pick up on? What's your message to the government today?
Well, I had a no surprise policy when I started writing it in 2019. I kept every government department informed. Yes, it is big. I mean, it covers every government department, more or less. And there was this no surprise policy, and there will be no surprises in government when the report was published. There's 23 very clear recommendations. It was published a year ago. I'm hoping that there will be a formal government response to it soon. I'm told that has now slipped again because that surprises me. It's very disappointing, but I'll wait to see when we get their formal response. There's a big section in the report on forced and coercive marriage. Now, I've been very, very clear in all the media that I've done over the past year that if there is nothing else in the report that's picked up on, they have to deal with this issue of forced and coercive marriage. We have tens of thousands of British mainly girls, but also some women and some men who we've been telling them for years, every political leader from, going back all the way to Margaret Thatcher and subsequent ones, and basically every political leader said forced and coercive marriage is wrong and we must do something about it. It is, I fear, in the too difficult box. But it goes back to some of the issues that I said earlier, where we have to be braver at tackling some of these issues, particularly where they're faith related. And forced and coercive marriage largely exists within different faith communities. It exists in all faith communities. It is particularly in the British Muslim community, the British Jewish, ultra-Orthodox Jewish community, and also in the Gypsy Roma traveller community, which is less religious, but there are religious elements that go alongside it. But it is very complicated. It is very difficult. But we can't have a violence against women and girls strategy and pat ourselves on the back for that if we don't tackle probably the biggest single issue, which is where we are allowing women and girls to be forced into marriage, and in some cases where men and women struggling with same-sex attraction are forced to marry as some kind of cure that exists within different faith communities. And I worry that government are sitting on the report because I've made a very, very clear set of recommendations that something needs to be done, and I don't think enough is done.
Colin Bloom, thank you very much indeed for being with us.